When we think of a sale, we usually picture a simple exchange, right? Goods for money. But what if a contract could be, well, more than that? What if it could be a framework for justice, for ethical commerce? That's the whole idea behind the Islamic concept of the contract of sale, known as bay, and we're about to dive into how it all works.
Everything really kicks off with this one verse from the Quran. It sets the foundation for everything we're about to discuss, and it establishes a really core principle. Trade isn't just okay, it's actively encouraged. But, and this is a huge but, there's a critical boundary. The goal is to build a whole system of commerce that's fair, that's transparent, and that is completely free from the exploitation of usury or interest.
All right, so here's our game plan for this explainer. We're essentially going to build a valid Islamic contract from the ground up. We'll start with its core purpose, then look at the pillars you need to construct it, the conditions that make it truly fair, and then we'll get into some really interesting historical prohibitions and modern debates.
So what is a just sale, really? Well, in Islamic law, a sale, or bay, is so much more than just a transaction. You should think of it as a carefully designed mechanism, one that's meant to ensure that any profit made is lawful, that both people in the deal give their full and free consent, and that the whole exchange actually promotes social justice.
Okay, so here's the technical definition for you. Bay is the exchange of one valuable thing for another valuable thing, and the specific goal, to legally transfer ownership. The whole framework is really guided by these principles that aim to get rid of any kind of deception or cheating, making sure it's a clean and honest deal for everyone.
Think about it like building a house. You absolutely need a solid foundation and some essential supports, right? Otherwise, the whole thing just collapses. Well, it's pretty much the same with a contract of sale. Every single valid contract has to be built on top of 3 non-negotiable pillars.
And here they are, the big 3. First, you need the parties. Pretty obvious, a buyer and a seller. Second, you've got to have the subject matter. That's the actual item being sold and the price you both agree on. And third, you need the expression, a totally clear offer from one person and an equally clear acceptance from the other. If you're missing even one of these, you just don't have a valid contract. Simple as that.
But, it's not just enough for these pillars to be there. Each one comes with its own set of rules. The parties involved have to have the legal capacity to even make a deal. The item itself has to be lawful, so no selling forbidden things. And this is critical, it has to actually exist, be owned by the seller, and be deliverable. You can't, for instance, sell fish that are still swimming in the ocean. And finally, the offer and the acceptance have to match perfectly, and it all has to happen in one continuous session.
So you've got your 3 pillars locked in place. Great. But that's just the basic structure, the skeleton. To make sure the contract is truly fair and actually enforceable, it also has to follow a specific blueprint of conditions. Let's just pause for a second here. You've got your buyer, your seller, and an item. Are we good to go? Is that really enough to seal the deal? Well, the answer is a clear no. And this is exactly where those conditions for validity come in. They act like a vital checklist that protects both people involved.
This is what I like to call the integrity checklist. First, the contract has to avoid something called gharar, which is basically any major uncertainty that could turn the sale into a gamble. For example, you can't sell a car for whatever the market price is tomorrow. That's a no-go. Second, no ikrah or coercion. Both parties have to agree to this willingly. And third, absolutely no tadlis, which is just fraud or deception. A seller is actually obligated to tell the buyer about any defects they know of.
Now, because these principles of certainty and transparency are so incredibly important, there's a whole category of sales that were explicitly forbidden. These are classic examples of contracts that just fundamentally break the rules we've been talking about.
The first one is a classic, Bay al-Hasat, otherwise known as the pebble throw sale. And yeah, it sounds just as strange as it is. Okay, so picture this. A merchant has a pile of goods. You agree to buy whichever item your thrown pebble happens to land on. This is completely prohibited because it's the perfect example of extreme uncertainty, or gharar. The buyer has absolutely no idea what they're actually buying until the very last second. That's not a sale, it's a gamble.
And sticking with that same logic, let's look at 2 other prohibited sales that were common back in the day: the touch sale and the throw sale.
So in these scenarios, a sale was considered final just by one person touching a folded piece of cloth or by 2 people throwing items back and forth. The key point here is that the deal is done without any proper inspection. And that's forbidden because it totally violates the principle that the buyer has to have clear and enough information about what it is they're buying.
Okay, so that covers the classical rules. But how do these ancient principles of fairness and transparency actually apply to the super complex world of modern finance? This is where we get into some really fascinating debates among scholars.
Let's take Bay al-Urban, which is basically earnest money, or what we'd call a non-refundable deposit. As you can see from this table, there is no single easy answer. The Maliki and Shafi schools traditionally said it's invalid because of all the uncertainty, the sale might not even go through. The Hanafi school called it voidable, but the Hanbali school actually permitted it, arguing that it's a valid condition that reasonably compensates the seller for taking an item off the market.
Now for a really contentious topic, Bay al-Dain, the sale of debt. Just look at this diagram. So creditor A is owed, let's say, $1,000 from debtor B. But A needs cash now. So what do? They sell that future IOU to a third party C for, say, $950 today. Person C now owns that debt and has the right to collect the full $1,000 from B when it's due.
So why is this so heavily debated? Well, there are several major red flags. First, it looks an awful lot like riba, or interest, because you're essentially trading money now for more money later. There's also uncertainty, that garar again, about whether the debt can even be collected. The seller doesn't physically possess what they're selling, and a lot of critics argue it just encourages trading in debt instead of investing in real, productive economic activity.
And finally, we have one of the most debated structures in all of Islamic finance, bay alina, the sale and buyback. Just follow the steps here. One person sells an item for, say, $1,100 on credit. Then, in a second transaction, they immediately buy that exact same item back for $1,000 in cash. So what's the net result? One person gets $1,000 in cash right now and is left with a debt of $1,100 that they have to pay later.
And this just perfectly illustrates the core of the whole debate. On the one hand, if you just look at the form, you've got what looks like two separate, totally valid sales. All the pillars are there. But on the other hand, critics argue the underlying purpose isn't a real sale at all. The item is just a placeholder. They see it as a legal trick, or a hila, designed to disguise what is, for all intents and purposes, an interest-based loan, which is forbidden. So, the crucial takeaway that comes out of all these debates is this really powerful ethical reflection. Form must not contradict purpose. It's simply not enough for a transaction to look correct on paper. The underlying intention has to align with the spirit of the law, which is all about promoting genuine trade and preventing disguised interest. And this leaves us with a final, really big thought. In a global economy that's just filled with incredibly complex financial instruments, what can we learn from a framework that puts justice first? How can these ancient ideas of fairness, transparency, and making sure a contract's purpose is as sound as its form, how can that help us build a more stable and equitable economy for everyone?